The storm had driven him in and locked him out from the world. The cave he had found refuge in was cold and dark. Its only warmth was that of his breath and that of the small fire that flickered before him. Of all the elements that exist in our world, he was most fascinated by fire. The way it moved, the way it danced. Conjured out of nothing with a few good strokes of stone, and it appeared like magic. It could give life, and it could take it away in an instant. The firelight did funny things to the walls of the cave. This cave had once been the home of somebody. Their paintings and markings covered every inch of stone, an overlapping mosaic of pictures, and the light of the fire made them move and shimmer across it. They used to tell ghost stories about this cave. When he was a boy, he and his friends would dare each other run in, grab a stone, and then run out again. They all did it at least once in their youth, but his friends were gone. And it was their ghosts that haunted these stones now. He'd seen them in his dreams, their figures moving through the shadows, never daring to come into the firelight. They whispered things to him in the dark, terrible things. They whispered what awaits him when he joins them, the whisper of the end of days and that eternal night. He did his best to cast them away, screaming, crying, begging for them to leave, and sometimes they would, but never for very long. They always came back to remind him of how it was his fault, how he was the reason they danced in the darkness, never allowed to feel the fire's warmth. He vaguely remembered what happened, although it was so many years ago. He tried so hard to forget that it almost worked, but it always found a way to resurface. It had been a harsh winter. The ice had set in earlier than usual, and his people suffered because of it. He and his friends, no more than walking skeletons from a lack of food, decided they'd brave the ice, see if they could find something to eat. They had been reluctant. Afraid of the whipping snow, they argued to wait for the blizzard that was building on the horizon to pass. He talked them down, arguing that it wouldn't be here anytime soon, that if they waited any longer they would all starve. In single file, fishing gear and short axes in hand, they trudged through the snow and out into the tundra. A small frozen lake that connected to a river half-mile north was often used by fish as a hideout during the colder seasons. It was their best hope of finding food. Time passed and the blizzard progressed. The wind grew even stronger, and the boys were nearly frozen to the bone. They reached the lake, and cutting holes in the ice, they set the lines and waited. The blizzard was much closer now. It stung their faces as they all huddled together on the ice. The line began to jerk, but they were so cold they didn't notice it at first. It wasn't until one of the younger boys yelled and they all saw it bobbing up and down. Beginning at the cold, they grabbed the line, pulled it back as hard as they could. The fish fought back, but it wasn't a match. Dragging it onto the ice sheet, they stuck a blade through its eye and deposited the catch in the bag. The blizzard was nearly on them. They didn't dare set another line out of fear that they would be caught out in it. But as they began to make their way back, they realised that their tracks were gone, blown over and buried by the storm, and with it the only way of knowing which way to get back home. Panic set in. They all argued with each other until the oldest, tall lad of 17, yelled above the noise and told them to start walking. They'd see the fires of the huts going through the fog, and they just head in the general direction they had come. Frozen and scared, they all began the trek home in the white wall that was the blizzard. One by one they started disappearing. He would look back from the front of the line to see that it had grown shorter. It didn't stop. None of them stopped, because to stop now would be a death sentence. One by one, they all disappeared until finally only he remained. Tears and snot froze into his face. He battled through the gale, only to look up to see if he could spot the fires in the distance. And after what seemed like hours of walking, he spotted not a fire, but a mass that was covered in snow by the shepherd of one of the huts. The shape somewhat revived him, somehow finding the strength to go faster. He half walked, half jogged through the flurry until it was in front of him. It was not a hut, it was the opening of a cave. He stayed in that cave for at least 3 days. There was enough wood that had been kept dry by the cave and shards of flint on the ground to start a small fire. He tried to make sure to ration the fish, but as hunger took over, it was gone almost as soon as it was cooked. As the storm raged outside, he paced the walls of the cave, trying his best to stay warm by moving, but also, for the first time properly, looking at the paintings on its interior. They were crude, but he could tell they'd been done with a purpose. It wasn't just a collection of paintings, it was a visual history. From hunts to wild animals, tailing of a small village, to handprints, created an open narrative about its creator. The storm finally ended, and the snow outside was calm. He looked at the walls one last time, to remember the last time he set foot in this place. They were dead, all of them. The storm had ripped the thatching off the roofs of the Lone Star huts, and they had all frozen to death, huddled together in their terror. Only he had survived. He had left his friends and family behind, and as punishment, he was forced to bear witness to it, alone. Couldn't even bury them. The ground was frozen solid. They would have to stay where they died until the spring sun thawed them out. Alone with nothing more than a sleeping roll and some supplies, he turned away from the bodies and headed back to the only place that would keep him alive. the cave. Years passed. The snow had melted away, and the following spring he'd buried his people. He tried his best to give them a proper burial, but as time wore on, he grew lazy with the rituals. Stopped saying the words and just did his best to make sure they were laid at peace. He found his friends as well. They were scattered across the tundra, some mere feet from each other. They too were given a proper burial. He made his home in the cave, did his best anyway. But every night they came. They came quietly at first, moving in his peripherals, never letting themselves be seen for longer than a moment. But over time they grew more bold. They lurked in the corners, allowed themselves to be noticed before retreating into the darkness. At night it was the worst. He couldn't see them, but he felt them. He heard them. Felt their cold fingers snatch at his pelts. Heard their whispers in the darkness. They left him shivering, even on the hottest of summer nights. The sweat from his mere mixing with the sweat from the heat, he lay there tormented. They were punishing him, and he knew that. Punishing him for still being alive. He should have died with them on the ice. Should have died with them, and then come spring the earth would have claimed their bodies. They would all be resting together equally. But no, he was the lucky one. He got to live. The storm battered the cave's exterior. Inside he sat alone. Alone in front of the fire, surrounded by nothing but ghosts he had created through his shame and his guilt. They were bolder tonight. The storm was fueling them. It reminded them of the night they'd been flung into the void. They'd come crawling back out to make sure he didn't forget it. Yeah, how could he forget it? It had plagued him all these years, and the whispering of phantoms in the dark wouldn't have changed that. The storm raged on, and the ghosts grew louder. He sat in front of the fire, hands clasped over his ears as the screaming of the wind outside mingled with the screaming of his mother, his little sister, his friends, family, everyone he knew and loved. They were screaming at him. Screaming for him to join them in the darkness. Screaming against the injustice that was his continued existence. It grew louder and louder and louder. He pushed his palms deeper into his ears because if he didn't block it out soon it would tear his head in half. Then suddenly, the cacophony stopped. Ears ringing, sudden silence that stunned him for a moment. It was a while before he realised that the screaming had stopped and the wind had died down. He uncovered his ears and looked at the mouth of the cave. The storm raged on, but there was something different about it now. It was silent, almost inviting. The blanket of white was calling to him, coaxing him out of his hideaway and into its icy embrace. He felt the ghosts again, but it was different this time. They stood around him and the fire, finally touched by its light. They stood there and said nothing. He rose to his feet. The figures around him parted as he made his way to the cave's entrance. He stood at its edge, staring into the blinding white that was before him. With the ghosts of his people behind him, and for the first time in years, clarity in his mind, he walked out into the storm.